It was the kind of warm coastal morning where the air clung heavy with the scent of salt water and the distant chatter of gulls. The kind of day that felt deceptively safe, like nothing horrific could possibly happen beneath a sky so blindingly blue. And yet that was the day everything changed for 28-year-old marine life trainer Jessica Marlowe, a woman whose entire adult life had been dedicated to understanding, caring for, and connecting with the ocean's most intelligent mammals, particularly dolphins. She had grown up in a small fishing village, often sneaking down to the dock just to watch them leap beyond the harbor barriers, captivated by their grace and uncanny spark of awareness in their eyes, a fascination that eventually drove her to study marine biology and take a position at Pacific Oceanarium, a massive seaside attraction that marketed itself as a bridge between the human and aquatic worlds, a place where the audience could believe they were witnessing friendship between species rather than a performance drilled into muscle memory by endless repetition and reinforcement. But what most tourists didn't see, what even many junior trainers didn't see, was the underlying tension in those glossy enclosures, the subtle shifts in a dolphin's body language, the tiny behavioral anomalies that hinted at something deeper, something less playful. And Jessica had been noticing those changes for months, particularly in one of their star dolphins, a massive male named Zephyr, nearly 10 feet long with a dorsal fin that bore a jagged scar from an encounter with a shark years ago. Zephyr had always been unusually focused on Jessica, watching her with a stillness the others didn't mimic, as though he was studying her in return. And though she respected him, she also harbored an unspoken unease whenever she was alone with him in the tank after hours. Something about the way he'd circle just out of reach, silent, waiting. That morning, the show was packed, bleachers full of families clutching popcorn and phones ready to record the famous synchronized leap finale, where the trainers would dive into the water and be pushed to the surface on the rostrums of the dolphins, launching them into a perfect backflip before splashing down in front of the crowd. And Jessica, experienced as she was, had no reason to think this show would be any different. But from the moment she entered the pool, she sensed something was off. Zephyr's movements were sharper, his clicks and whistles pitched lower, almost like the subsonic warnings dolphins emit in the wild when something is wrong. The crowd couldn't hear it over the amplified music, but Jessica could feel it, like pressure in her chest. And when her cue came to signal Zephyr for the push, instead of positioning himself under her feet, he veered suddenly and rammed her in the ribs hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs, sending her tumbling underwater, disoriented. Before she could recover, he grabbed her arm in his jaws, not biting to puncture, but clamping down with enough force to drag her deeper into the pool, away from the other trainers. Panic flared in her mind as her vision blurred from lack of air, and she tried the standard disengagement maneuver they'd been taught, pressing on the sensitive pressure point behind his melon. But Zephyr twisted, dragging her toward the maintenance gate at the far end of the enclosure, the part that connected to the sea pens, and for a split second she thought maybe he was leading her out to safety, until she realized his movements weren't random. They were deliberate, fast, and frighteningly strong, as though she weighed nothing. And then they were in the pen's deeper section, shadowed from the audience's view. And that's when the other dolphins appeared. 3 more, all males, surrounding her in a slow spiral, their bodies cutting through the water with an eerie calmness that contrasted violently with the thundering of her pulse in her ears. She kicked, tried to break free, but each time she moved, one of them intercepted, nudging or blocking her path. Above, she could see the shimmering light of the surface, distorted and impossibly far away, and the muffled sound of whistles and splashing told her the other trainers had noticed. But Zephyr wasn't letting go. His grip shifted to her leg, pulling her downward again, the pressure squeezing her skull as they dove deeper than she'd ever been in that enclosure. She realized, with a jolt of terror, that these dolphins weren't performing. They were hunting, and she was the prey. And in that moment, she remembered a paper she'd read years ago about aggressive cetacean behavior in captivity, how stress and confinement could trigger primal instincts, even toward humans they'd known for years, and how documented cases were often buried by marine parks to protect their public image. A surge of survival instinct overrode her fear, and she twisted violently, raking her nails across Zephyr's eye, forcing him to release her for a fraction of a second. Enough for her to kick toward the surface, lungs screaming for air, but before she could break through, one of the other males rammed her in the stomach, and pain shot through her body as the precious last air escaped her mouth in a cloud of bubbles. She saw spots, felt her limbs growing weak, but somewhere above, a rescue pole broke the surface. A trainer's hand plunging into the water, and she clawed for it, fingers just brushing the edge when Zephyr surged up beneath her and slammed her against the side of the pool so hard she thought her spine had snapped. The next moments were a blur, a cacophony of shouts, the sudden rush of bodies diving in, the cold scrape of the net as they forced the dolphins back, strong arms hauling her up and out of the water as she coughed and vomited seawater onto the concrete, blinking against the harsh sunlight, heart hammering, later in the sterile quiet of the hospital room. With her ribs bandaged and lungs aching, she learned from a sympathetic vet tech that Zephyr had been transferred to an off-site facility within hours of the incident, the official story being that he'd been showing signs of stress and needed rest. But the tech hinted at something darker, that this wasn't the first time a dolphin at the Oceanarium had attacked a trainer, and that the management's policy was to erase those incidents from public record entirely. Jessica would never work there again. She couldn't even step into shallow seawater without her pulse spiking. But at night she'd dream of Zephyr's unblinking gaze in the green depths, the way he'd studied her like she was the strange creature, and she knew, with a cold certainty, that he'd been planning that moment for longer than anyone realized, that somewhere out there in the deeper ocean, if he'd been released, he was still circling, still watching, and still remembering her scent in the water.